I'm very excited about this event. As long as I've been working in the realm of national security law, I've been following the journalism of Mark Mazzetti. He is an indispensable reporter with an astonishing grasp of the institutional and operational details that are the lifeblood of both military operations and intelligence community activities. And it's always refreshing to read his reporting on the issues of the moment because it's so clearly informed by this sort of detail he garners not just from being an observer of these events, but from practical experience. For example, when he embedded with the Marines in 2003, spent a great deal of time in Iraq as a result. Mark's a Pulitzer Prize winner and winner of a number of other awards for his national security-focused reporting. As you know, he is currently the New York Times national security correspondent based out of Washington, although currently on sabbatical for a project he can tell you about in a moment. Previously wrote for the LA Times, and before that was with The Economist, based here in Austin. So he's no stranger to our lovely hometown. And with that observation, I'm going to segue into the conversation that we're going to have. I wanted to ask you, Mark, just how is it you went from being a reporter in Austin covering Governor Bush's campaign and events in the Southwest, all throughout the region? How did you transform from that into being a national security journalist?
Well, first of all, it's terrific being here, and I'm very thrilled to be invited here back to Austin and to UT. I love coming back here, and could not pass up a chance to go back to Gueros. So it's great, and so thank you for having me, and I look forward to the discussion. I spent 2 years in Austin from 1999 to 2001, and covering the Southwest for The Economist, and it involved a lot of writing about then Governor Bush's record in Texas as he was running for president, and decided to move to Washington in the beginning of 2001, and took a job with U.S. News and World Report. Hopefully some of you remember that magazine. Unfortunately,
Isn't that a rankings company?
Yeah, they do. You know, you decide where you go to college based on U.S. News and World Report. So I was covering basically general assignment and politics for the magazine when, in the spring of 2001, my editor came into my office and asked me whether I wanted to cover the Pentagon. And I said, because our then Pentagon correspondent was moving to New York for personal reasons, and I said, that's fine. I said, I know nothing about the defense world. And he said, his answer was, well, that's okay, because really nothing's going on. So you have a lot of time to learn. And he instructed me that it was the beginning of the Bush administration, so the only thing really happening was missile defense and the president's plan to sort of spend a lot of money on this missile shield. So he said, spend the summer learning this. So I spent the summer of 2001 studying the physics of missile defense and the intricacies of various stages of missile defense, and all leading up to a cover story I was hoping to do in the fall of 2001, actually slated to run the week of September 11th. And it did not run, needless to say. I think it ran at some point, like months later, inside. But as I was telling a group this morning, I never did another story on missile defense. The story changed quite a bit. And so it was all of a sudden, when defense, national security became the #1 issue, I was finding myself at the Pentagon feeling woefully in over my head, with going up against other reporters who had been on the beat for 15, 20 years, the David Martin of CBS, and Tom Ricks of the Washington Post, and people who had been, some of the generals currently running the Pentagon. They'd been hanging out when they were majors, and they'd return their calls. I didn't really know any of these people, so it was a trial by fire. I found the best thing to do was advice I got was to get out of Washington and go into the field and meet some people out there and find out what's going on in Afghanistan. So in early 2002, I took my first trip over there and ended up in Kandahar and did an embed with the 101st Airborne and sort of did unembedded reporting as well. But it was good advice, because not only you're where the action is happening in the sort of hugest story maybe you'll ever cover, but you'll also meet people, and I did meet people out there who, especially in the military world, who kept getting promoted. They came back to the Pentagon. They became good sources. I developed sort of my own group of sources, and it was better than trying to sort of stalk the halls of the Pentagon, going up against some of the people who've been doing it a lot longer. So that was sort of my entry into this world, and it's been a very exciting 10 years.
And you're on sabbatical currently, and you're writing a book. Why don't you tell everybody about what you're writing?
So I'm sort of trying to sort of look at primarily the last 10 years and how, away from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've had a sort of whole nother war that's taken place that we've gotten glimpses of, but it's the sort of war outside of the declared war zone. So I'm looking at how going to operating in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia has sort of changed American warfare to some degree, changed the CIA and the Pentagon sort of into manhunting organizations, bringing out new technology like drones, and sort of creating a new model where that I think the Obama administration has really embraced, and will be to some degree the model for the future, as particularly this administration. They pulled out of Iraq. They're trying to draw down in Afghanistan. The big wars, the feeling is that we don't have the money for, we don't, the public doesn't have the appetite for, and yet these sort of shadow wars are something that are sustainable, but done in secret, and that brings all sorts of implications. So I'm sort of looking at how this transformation took place from the early days after 9/11 to events that are sort of signature events in this transformation, like the bin Laden raid, the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen in September, to the point where we've sort of been using this so much, it's become so common, and yet we almost don't talk about it enough. And I know, drawing on Bobby's work, but Bobby does think about this and talk about it a lot. So, and so sort of some of your work has been invaluable in looking at this transformation, and also looking about some of the history. Where did the CIA come in on 9/11? Where was the Pentagon on 9/11? And how they've sort of converged over the last decade.
Well, let's talk about that history, because it's fascinating stuff. Now, there's probably a lot of people in the room here who know a great deal about this, but let's assume that everyone's coming at this without that sort of firm grasp on the history. CIA is often said to have its roots in OSS from World War II. Over time, it evolves. However, when it becomes the CIA, it's a fully civilian institution. But it's not that it has no prior involvement in what we could today describe as these shadow wars, right? What was it like pre-9/11? How would you describe the position of the CIA in particular when it comes to operational activity other than stealing secrets and non-kinetic covert action?
Well, if you look at, if you study the history of the CIA, it's this there's always a pendulum about how much they really want to get involved in the nitty-gritty of covert action, assassination, kinetic, or killing people. Over its history, the CIA has gotten involved. Certainly, the OSS was pretty much a purely paramilitary organization. It was really an arm of the military to do things to support the war effort, like sabotaging bridges and doing sort of dirty tricks against the Nazis. And then it evolves during the Cold War, where you're supposed to be an espionage service, stealing secrets, penetrating hard targets. But repeatedly, you see presidents going to the CIA for covert action. And a lot of the history is very familiar, where the CIA got involved in coup attempts. They got involved in assassination plots. There were plots to kill Castro. There was the Bay of Pigs. And you always see the pendulum then, sort of after these events, swing back away from this covert action, because there's this view in the CIA, like, this only gets us into hot water. And then there's a period of retrenchment, and then all of a sudden they start doing it again. So this period of retrenchment in the 70s with the Church Committee, where the Congressional Committee started to unearth all of these things, was this really low point for the CIA, because it was just all of the dirty laundry was being aired, and it was very embarrassing. And so I think you had a whole generation of CIA officers who sort of came into the service right after Church, and they were brought in under the sort of view that the CIA should be doing traditional espionage. Don't get into covert action. It gets us into trouble. So when you get to pre-9/11, I think in the years before 9/11, I think you had a lot of those officers who had risen through the ranks and taken somewhat leadership positions. And so you saw a real tension in the years before 9/11 about whether they should sort of be aggressive against bin Laden. There's a real fight over the predator. Should the CIA be, it's sort of amazing to think now that the CIA was really torn about whether to use an armed predator. I mean, it's such a common, it's their, many see it as their sort of golden weapon, right? If they use it, it's their, the Obama administration has been, ordered more predator strikes than the Bush administration by orders of magnitude. But really 10 years ago, and a little bit more than 10 years ago, CIA was really torn about, are we getting back into the assassination business? Interestingly, the 9/11 Commission talked to a former head of the Counterterrorism Center, a pre-9/11 head of the Counterterrorism Center, who said, if he was given a direct order to kill Osama bin Laden, he wouldn't have carried it out. Because, again, it was, we're the CIA, we shouldn't do that. Not that Osama bin Laden didn't need to die, but the CIA shouldn't be doing it. So a lot of what the 9/11 Commission came out with was sort of, and the run-up was sort of how these faulty programs to spy on bin Laden and who should get the predator and should the military do it or should the CIA do it. It all became kind of moot on 9/11 when everything changed, as they say.
What's interesting about that, it's a story you've told of the significance of institutional culture and of the actual people who come up with a certain sense of what the career incentives are and what is good for the institution over time based on lessons they've learned the hard way. It's also a story about technological change with the armed predator not being an option in, say, the 80s and into the early 90s, and only just beginning the glimmer of the armed predator coming online right before 9/11. But things got, and then there's the overlay of legal constraints as well, and this question of whether or not using lethal force in the name of counterterrorism against al-Qaeda would be an assassination. As you say, that was the red line and inscribed in Executive Order 12333 that everyone knows about and talks about. Now, it all gets muddy after the East African embassy bombings in 1998, when those two embassies are attacked. Famously, the Clinton administration responded in part by launching cruise missiles, both in the Sudan and in Afghanistan. And there's all sorts of debates about the wisdom and efficacy of that particular move, but one thing it certainly was an express effort to try to kill bin Laden and some others. At the exact same moment in time, in the aftermath of that attack and the internal debates about possible follow-on attacks that we might launch in an effort to further complete that job, there's the big tussle that the 9/11 Commission report documents pretty well about whether CIA, acting through the proxies that it has in the field in Afghanistan, whether it can have them use lethal force. And can you say a little bit about what that fight was all about? Or?
Well, right. It's this issue of, does the CIA have the authority to kill people? And even if you're using proxies to do it, Afghans, George Tenet was very worried about this, and he actually writes about it in his book, and that if the military, the problem was, the stated problem was they couldn't find bin Laden, right? So they had all these ways to try to find him. They had submarines stationed off in the Arabian Gulf if they ever got intelligence, but they could never find out where he was. So that was sort of how the predator came in. Like, if we could send a predator over Afghanistan, we could try to hunt him and find him. But the question was still, could we kill him? Could we use proxies? And I think that, it seems to me it's still murky and up for debate exactly what the authorities they were given. There's still different schools of thought when you talk to different people about whether the Clinton administration and the Bush administration before 9/11 had given the CIA authority to kill bin Laden. And some say no. You might have a clearer sense of it. I still find that after 9/11, of course, everyone was trying to position themselves and say, well, of course we gave them authority, and they should have done it, and they didn't act. Whereas the CIA says, we never got a clear authority, we were worried about it. Obviously, when an event like 9/11 happens, everyone is trying to look good, and they're trying to sort of show why they were responsible for it. However, the sort of proxies, there were, the CIA said that they, some in the CIA said that they had plans ready to sort of go after bin Laden and kill them, and they never got the authority to do it. Others said, well, they didn't have good enough intelligence. So it's a sort of period, and then you can say, well, could you have averted 9/11? And again, some say that you could have.
The question of what the authorities actually were in this 1998 to 2000 period, it's such a tough one, obviously, because the documents are not exactly just lying around on the desk waiting for us to look at and judge.
Yeah.
There's been enough reporting on it, you have a pretty good sense of one of the problems being the following. I think it's an important lesson about the difference between what the legal rule, and I mean legal rule very broadly to encompass just what's the executive branch's internal ordering of things, what it may actually be in the abstract in a classroom sense, and what it may be understood to be in actual practice once filtered through the lens of the institution itself. It looks like what you have in the aftermath of 1998, August 1998, the East African embassy bombings occur. There are a series of memorandums of notification adjusting and expanding the array of authorities through which the CIA can ask different proxy forces. There's this one group, there's this other group, there's some Northern Alliance people, there's some probably Pashtun tribesmen, we don't know, getting different ground rules. And there is one memorandum in that sequence that appears to go much further than the others, or much clearer than the others in terms of giving the green light for them to use lethal force, not just in self-defense, but if you can find bin Laden, you can capture him, great, but if not, go ahead and kill him. That one, being the most sensitive one, was also by far the most closely held. And one of the things the 9/11 Commission report suggests is that precisely because there was this extremely extra close hold approach to it, it really didn't filter out into the broader agency culture that this type of green light had been authorized at any point, and led to a lot of people later on saying, look, we were never given the green light. And so maybe there's a matter of some people got the green light, but most people never heard about that.
Right.
Well, so speaking of the role of institutional culture, part of that is the role of individual personalities. As we think about what happens once you get to 9/11 itself and the decision making that goes on, the institutional slotting that occurs in the immediate aftermath of this in terms of whether it's going to be big military, special forces, CIA, who's going to be first in on the ground in Afghanistan, who's going to be at the true point of the spear, there's an opportunity here for some institutional competition. And I think personality, you've suggested, is going to play did play a major role in how those decisions were made. And it wasn't just a matter of, well, here's an institution that had this capability. It was bound to be that they were going to get this assignment. How did that all unfold?
Well, you had some of the history of the CIA in Afghanistan. Obviously, the CIA's got a pretty lengthy history in Afghanistan that we know about. But even the years before, they had done some, made some contact with the Northern Alliance, so with some of the Pashtuns in the South. So on 9/11, you saw, George Tenet, for various reasons, I think, sort of stand up and say, we want to sort of take the lead on this. We've been studying Al Qaeda. We've been warning. You guys didn't listen to our warnings. We'll sort of, we got guys ready to go in 2 weeks, and we'll be in Afghanistan, link up with our guys, and we'll take charge. So this was not the CIA getting sort of dragged into the counterterrorism arena. They very much were eager to do it, including the detention authority. I mean, this was something that I think was a CIA-driven process. At the same time, you had at the Pentagon, you had Rumsfeld, no shrinking violet, who saw, we're the military, this is a war, and we should be in charge. And it's interesting because you've started to see some of the documents be declassified where Rumsfeld was pulling his hair out that the CIA beat him into Afghanistan. And he says, there's these memos where he says, don't you think that it would be good if we didn't have a total dependence on the CIA for everything in Afghanistan? And so I think what you find is that very early on after 9/11, there's certain processes that get set in motion. That Rumsfeld decides, we can't move fast enough, we can't go into places that we're not used to being in, we don't have good intelligence, let's do all these things. the CIA says, okay, we're doing intelligence. We need sort of better paramilitary functions. We need to be better hunters to go at. If we're going to be really good at counterterrorism, we need to develop capabilities to be manhunters. So they both did it, and sort of after 10 years, it ends up they're sort of mirroring each other. But it sort of was set in motion, in part, I think, because of the personalities of both people. I think that sort of what got created at the Pentagon was, after several years, was an entire intelligence shop that didn't exist before, that in some ways was born from Rumsfeld's frustration that he had to rely on the CIA. I mean, there's a famous quote where he says something to the extent that he's like a little bird waiting to be fed a worm by the CIA, because he didn't have any of his own intelligence. So I think a lot of what has transpired the last 10 years started in these days when both institutions felt ill-equipped. And so in some ways, they started aping each other.
So a different director, perhaps, pick a figure from the past, I don't know, Turner or Deutsch. If they'd been director then, is it possible that the CIA wouldn't have moved forward, offered itself institutionally as aggressively?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know whether the sort of personality of George Tenet is such that it would have only been. Again, Tenet, he was not a CIA officer. He came from Capitol Hill, so he didn't have the sort of institutional concerns about this. But he had, been at the agency in the 90s and seen that, he was not in the sort of aggressive covert action mode, but. As has come out later, he was someone who certainly wanted the White House to listen to, and he wanted the agency to be at the center of things. And he was that personality that he was going to sort of thrust the agency to the center. So I think that part of his personality probably really did set the CIA on the path. He did have concerns about some of the things that they ended up doing, however, before 9/11. But once 9/11 happened, it was like this was going to be the CIA's war.
You were saying a moment ago that you end up over time with this convergence between what JSOC and Special Forces does to some extent as they get more and more into the intelligence collection and analysis game, while the CIA is becoming more and more paramilitary, particularly obviously through drones. Mm-hmm. Are there other components besides the drones that reflect this kinetic turn?
There's been the Counterterrorism Center at CIA has become really big. It was before 9/11, it was a small group of people many of whom were pretty obsessed about bin Laden.
Was it the place you wanted to be?
No, it wasn't the place you wanted to be. And it was like the backwater. If you wanted a promotion inside the CIA and inside the Directorate of Operations, you weren't doing terrorism. And obviously that has changed entirely. Just sort of quickly on, now, Counterterrorism Center is where you punch your ticket in order to advance to the CIA. And, they have people coming right out of what they call the farm, which is their training. They're either going to Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan to do sort of manhunting stuff. So this is what they're training the young people to do. And this is the concern to some degree among retired officers you talk to, is that they're all being trained to this set of skills, and they don't know how to do sort of the classic espionage, the classic, running sources, stealing secrets, that type of thing.
Just to digress, because this is an important digression. Let's stay on this for a second, because I think it's an important theme. So what is lost here, it's not just the skill set, but the potential blind spots that form if what you're looking for is specific individuals for the very important counterterrorism mission. What topics are not being explored? What is the cost in that sense?
Well, one of the things that's really, I think, essential for counterterrorism is your relationship with liaison spy services. It becomes, above all, your relationship with the ISI in Pakistan, with the Mukhabarat in Egypt, with the Yemeni intelligence service. Basically, these are the guys who are on the ground who have been trying to chase terrorists, right? And so you're going to have to cozy up to them in order to get scalps. The problem is that if you are only dealing with the intelligence service of the regime, you don't necessarily have the best picture of what's going on outside of the regime. And I think that if you take, for instance, the Arab Spring, there are some things that I think probably the CIA has been blamed for, probably unfairly, like, why didn't they predict that Tunisia, this guy would set himself on fire in Tunisia? Well, you should have predicted that. I mean, there's things that, it's impossible to predict. That's like fortune telling, right? However, I think where there's a more valid criticism potentially is once Tunisia happens, like how do you assess the likelihood that Egypt's going to fall? And Mubarak's regime is going to go down. Now, if you're primarily if you're at the agency, and I've talked to people who have been in Cairo since 9/11, and they say, our job was to deal with the intelligence service to find terrorists. It was not to go out on the street, talk to the Muslim Brotherhood, talk to the dissenters and the political groups in Egypt who might ultimately rise up against the regime. So you're a little bit blind. You called it blind spots. If your sources are the guys who are in the regime, you're not going to necessarily know when the regime's about to fall. And so I think we're still learning. It's only been a year, so we'll know more about how the CIA performed. But I think that's a big concern. And people you talk to, they do worry about counterterrorism is a worthwhile goal, and it's been very important in the last 10 years. But there are opportunity costs.
Right. Well, okay, so before we went on that digression, we were talking about whether there are other aspects of the CIA's kinetic term besides the mechanized drone aspect.
Right.
And this raises topics like proxy forces.
Right. So there are, the agency also has a group called Special Activities Division, which is, again, like, in the history, their power and their strength waxes and wanes depending on how much the CIA wants to be doing this sort of covert training. And since 9/11, they've been built up quite significantly. They do a lot of training of proxy armies. You may have heard about some of these militias that the CIA runs in Afghanistan to go after the Taliban and militants. They're basically CIA-trained armies. There's one in Kandahar, there's one in Khost. There's about 4 or 5. That's primarily Special Activities Division that does that training. And Special Activities Division is again, it's another weird subculture within the agency where it's primarily former special operations troops who retire and then go to work for the CIA as trainers. And so it's a little bit of a revolving door, but there are people who have the bread and butter of Green Berets is to do foreign training. And so it's these type of guys who then go to the CIA who do this covertly. And so that's a pretty big group of people now who are doing this training. They're doing some in Yemen as well. Beyond that, it gets a little bit murkier, but one of the things that came up in the last, it sort of broke about 3 or 4 years ago, was that the CIA, after 9/11, was trying to develop what it became called an assassination program, which was basically or assassination teams, where you had groups of people, what you would imagine from the movies, right? It's like Jason Bourne, and that they are trained assassins to go walk up to it's my Italian roots, I gesticulate a lot, go up to someone on the street and kill them. And so when it broke, on one hand you could say, I really thought that they had this, and it's really not like the movies. But the program got into hot water because various congressional committees and others sort of got queasy about the idea of having hit squads. Now, one could raise the question, well, if you're going so crazy with the Predator, really, what's the difference? If you're killing people with a Predator, what's the difference between that and killing people, with a bullet? So these are the types of sort of capabilities that they've tried to, in this case, seems to be gone hot and cold on. So that's on the sort of like the really kinetic side. Obviously, they've, as far as I can tell, pretty much gotten out of the detention stuff, which many of them are quite happy about because of all of the tremendous fallout.
So you talked about the potential equivalency between drone strikes and other ways of exercising lethal force. A lot of what we've been talking about so far is talking about conduct and lethal force directed into the AFPAC theater, where throughout it, at least for a little while longer, we've got a hot battlefield in a context in which we can with mostly in agreement, say we've got an armed conflict with law of war type concepts of using lethal force. It all makes sense. It seems that what's really interesting and what I think is what's really cool about your book project and where I think we're heading in the second post 9/11 decade, as you know, is that we're talking really about the center of gravity shifting out of the hot battlefield, maybe the loss of the hot battlefield altogether. The Iraq hot battlefield, for our purposes, has already gone away. The Afghanistan one may go away. But already, when you think about where the CIA uses its drones and so forth, and where other actions take place, not always with CIA, sometimes JSOC, it's not always in the hot battlefield, it's beyond.
Right.
And so let's talk about where have they been in the past decade outside of Afghanistan with respect to the battle?
Well, it's, I mean, the obvious one is Pakistan, and AFPAC sometimes gets put together as one mass, but there really are very clear, there's two separate countries, two very different sets of rules of engagement where, I mean, one is, a very obvious declared war zone. Pakistan is a quasi-declared war zone, but only the CIA really can operate there. So Pakistan, I think, is the most obvious example. It's been the center of gravity of most of what the CIA has been doing. But in the last few years, you see much more extensive activity in Yemen, in Somalia, and some of that has been going on for 10 years, but I think it's sort of escalated there as the administration started looking beyond Afghanistan and Pakistan. Where are the problems? I mean, I think that they're worried about the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen. Many say it's more dangerous than the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. People are talking a lot about North Africa now, and I don't really have a whole lot of a clear window into what's happening, but I think, again, post-Arab Spring, there seems to be this concern about what comes in after the Arab Spring, and again, there's tension. We should embrace the Arab Spring for its democratic potential. Some in the CIA see only headache as groups with, like the Muslim Brotherhood or some of the groups in Libya gain more power. We don't know what they're like. Who are they aligned with? The counterterrorism people there are worried, and I think JSOC and those guys. So I think that there's escalation in North Africa. So I think Africa is sort of a whole nother battleground that we're going to see more of in the future. Nigeria. I mean, it's hard to sort of say in the future, but it's. I believe that as much as you hear from the White House about repositioning everything. Away from the Middle East, away from the Arab world, moving towards China, repositioning our forces to Asia. I think to some degree it's a little bit of wishful thinking because it's not like there's a lot of, it's not like we sort of wrapped up our business in a tidy way in that part of the world.
No, that's true. You've mentioned JSOC, we've talked about JSOC some, and specifically you've talked about the parallel between the capacities. Sometimes it's downright overlapping within a single theater where they're doing the same thing. And Yemen and al-Awlaki was a prime example of this. Could you tell everybody a little bit about that overlap and why is it that the CIA in the end comes in and finishes the job?
Well, I think the short story is that for a couple of years JSOC has basically been running this war in Yemen. And the CIA, while they've been focused on Pakistan, they sort of divided up the different parts of the world. As the CIA started winding down in Pakistan and started, to some degree, I think maybe opportunistically saying, well, all right, the next big one is Yemen. We're really going to start focusing more on Yemen. They started developing intelligence. They tried to sort of penetrate the Al-Qaeda group in Yemen. And I think there was concern in the White House about the fact that a lot of what the Pentagon and JSOC had been doing didn't turn out well. There were a couple botched strikes. Innocent people were killed. There was a lot of frustration about that. And I think the CIA, at the end, with al-Awlaki, found him and relocated their predators and killed them. So you have these two parallel, as you said, drone operations, one run by the Pentagon, one run by the CIA, both of them in Yemen. It's hard to know exactly the difference. And someone will say, well, there's a big difference. One's a covert action and one's a secret action. And, thanks, that really clears it up. I mean, it
keeps me in business.
Some of these things, right. I mean, you can define things legally any way you want, but for all practical purposes, there is no difference. I mean, it's not like one is covert action, so therefore the military one, a Pentagon spokesman's getting up in front of a podium and saying, yesterday in Yemen we did this, this, and this. They're not. They're both secret. And so what was once, I think there was a brighter line between a covert and clandestine, and terms lawyers have come up with to put rules in the road for how the CIA should operate and how the Pentagon should operate. I don't think those lines really exist anymore.
So the interesting thing about that is that the main purpose of having a legal definition in statute of covert action is that that's the linchpin for imposing both internal executive branch decision-making procedures, and specifically to make the president personally endorse the operation or the program, and thereby bringing to bear probably the interagency process at the NSC level and screening things, but then also to link Congress in, because the findings and the memorandums of notification have to be reported to the oversight committees, and therefore both putting more pressure on the executive branch, but also creating some accountability for Congress, where maybe Congress would have otherwise preferred not to have had it. When you're not a covert action, one of the consequences is you're, by definition, not subject to that reporting requirement. And this gets us to the topic of whether, if you have two institutions, JSOC and CIA, with more or less overlapping capacities, regardless of where they're deployed, and one has a different oversight regime and decision-making regulatory structure than the other. Should we be concerned about this? Do you get the sense that this is something that people on the inside think is a burning issue? Or is it just the sort of thing that law profs like me sort of think, oh, that's an interesting intellectual puzzle?
I think it's more than that. I think it's also more than some of the sort of bureaucratic internal fights you hear out of this. Because some of the CIA people say, oh, well, we have to go up to Congress 4 times a year to justify everything we do. The Pentagon gets away with murder, maybe literally, but with operations they can do, because their requirement is not, you are required to come to Congress to tell us what you're doing. It's really sort of like, if you would like to come up, we'd like to hear what you're doing. I mean, there's no mandate for the Pentagon to require, by law, requires JSOC to report their activities. Now, I think internally, for the most part, they realize it's in their interest to do so, to get Congress on board with funding, because once it leaks out in the press that the JSOC's doing something they never told Congress about, there goes the funding, and there goes all the goodwill. I think it is something that we worried about, and I think that potentially because anytime there are two different very similar operations, one with a lot of reporting requirements and one with very few, there might be a tendency internally to go with the one with fewer reporting requirements because it's just easier to do. I think that's still being sorted out. I mean, I think we're still trying to figure out what are the implications of all this.
So as so much of the conflict already, as we've been talking about, is taking place in the shadows, and in the future we can expect the center of gravity to be still more in the shadows, it highlights the importance, perhaps, of the media in making sure that the American public actually has some sense of what's going on here, but also highlights the eternal dilemma in covering national security affairs that are covert, clandestine, secret, what have you, because often, though not always, but often that's for damn good reason. So can you talk about the role that you must struggle with all the time in grappling between the desire to just unearth the secrets and share them and tell these fascinating stories, and the question of whether these stories should all be told, and how much does the public need to know?
It's the sort of ultimate question, right? And something we do wrestle with constantly. There is, there are secrets and there are secrets. There are secrets that I know that are classified that I wouldn't put in the paper because I don't necessarily think there's a burning public interest to have them, and could very well put people in trouble, in jeopardy. Like, for instance, the classic is naming CIA agents, officers. I know the names of plenty of undercover people, and I haven't put them in the paper, mostly because there's no reason to, and the person could very well, be put in harm's way. Locations of CIA, specific locations of installations and that type of thing. There's questions about that. The problem is that if you're sort of putting that to one side, but there's a whole other area where there's really a debate over, and the debate is between usually the media and the government over what is legitimate story and what should come out. I think that, I was telling a group this morning, if you go back to the days after 9/11, when Vice President Cheney made a comment, something to the effect of, this whole war we're doing is going to be in secret, and it's all going to be the shadows, and it's going to last generations. So the choice the press had, I think, was either to say, okay, go do your war, we'll check back in a couple of generations and see how it went, or to sort of go in there and find out what was going on. And I think that, I don't have a question that on balance, the press has done I think a very good job unearthing important stories that the public needed to have a right to know about, and the government may not have been happy that we reported them, but I think were legitimate stories and what the press should be reporting. There's countless big stories and small stories, I think. It's also because you can't, I don't think, just stand on, well, something is classified, because there's a game in Washington where classified information leaks all the time if it's in the interest of those in power to leak it. So to say, well, you can't report it because it's classified, they're really saying, you can't report it because I don't want you to report. It's not my sort of spoon-fed classified information that we're telling. I mean, we talk every day about drone strikes, and those are still classified. So that's not a good argument. I think the good argument is, a better argument is if they can make a case that what you're reporting, will do real harm to a program that's working or to specific individuals. And I think what a lot of people don't know is that, as an organization like the Times or any real news organization, there's a real process where this plays out. It's not just I learned something and I'm do a quick edit, put it up on the web, especially on sensitive things. I mean, we always will call for comment the agency we're writing about, whether it's the CIA or the Pentagon, and say, basically, this is the story we're doing. And they have the opportunity to give a comment. They also have the opportunity to say, we ask you not to run this story. And then there's a process that sets in motion where if a government spokesman says to me, we don't want you to run the story, I can't then say, all right, I'm not going to. It's sort of, I say, well, you're going to have to talk to my boss, and your boss is going to have to talk to my boss, and sort of goes up the chain. And depending on how seriously people take it, it can end up where, the CIA director will talk to the editor of the New York Times about what the damage this story could do. And in many cases, it usually doesn't go up that high, and in some cases, they will say, if you withhold just this one detail, run your story, but if you hold this one detail, you may not know it, but this detail could really, get someone killed. And if they make a solid case for that, I think in many cases we're willing to listen. And if we don't think that, we don't think that it changes the story significantly. And so we do this constantly. It's the sort of everyday work of national security reporters, is being in touch with government sources, and not too long before you're ready to run the story, but long enough to give people a chance to comment. You're telling them what you're running.
That's in a way describable as the front end process. There is this back end process where DOJ comes in and investigates and prosecutes leakers and subpoenas reporters, and we've heard a lot about the idea that the Obama administration has been more aggressive than any predecessor on this particular front with respect to national security leaks. And there's some debate about that, but do you have a sense that there is a changing climate, that there is or at least an attempt to try to crack down on the flow of the non-favorable leaking that goes on?
I think the evidence is unmistakable that there is a more aggressive effort right now to crack down on leakers. It's just the proof is in the prosecutions, attempted prosecutions. I think it's 5 or 6 indictments, I don't remember, since the Obama administration came in. And they're pretty high profile cases of people who were talking to reporters. And some of these prosecutions have blown up, and so I think there's a debate about whether, even though going down that road, even if you're not successful prosecuting a leaker, do you successfully deter future leakers from talking to people like me? And I think that there's a case for that. I think that I just know that in the course of my reporting and now working on this book, I mean, there's plenty of people who I reach out to who don't respond, or some people have even told me bluntly, like, I'm not going to go to jail. This is, do you see what's going on? It's not worth it. And so I kind of feel like anecdotally, from my own experience, it's having an effect. I think that, yet we haven't gone down the road of going after reporters themselves, trying to throw reporters themselves in jail or news organizations for leaking classified information, or reporting classified information under the Espionage Act. But I can tell you there is concern that that's the road that's going down. And I'll tell you, the first group of WikiLeaks documents that we got, which was in the summer of, I guess it was in the summer of 2010, where these were a lot of military reporting from Afghanistan. And we didn't really know what we had, but we knew this was kind of the largest data dump, just physical in terms of sheer size of classified information to go to a news outlet, and maybe since the Pentagon Papers, I'm not sure. And the fear was, I think, and we had a lot of discussions with lawyers, that this could be a test case for a administration going after the New York Times or whomever to make a statement that this won't stand. Now, it didn't turn out that way.
What's interesting about that is you describe a model in which we're simultaneously seeing a greater signaling to people who have the information on the inside that they should not be sharing it with reporters, at a time when there's ever more interesting things going on in the shadows. And that people are reacting to these signals by clamming up to some extent. Yet that some of the same technological innovation, not the same technological innovations, but the fact that there's technological innovation that makes the war in the shadows ever more possible, particularly with drones. Other innovations like communications technology make things like WikiLeaks possible, and you have this world in which maybe the sort of traditional leaking becomes a little less frequent, but wholesale, unvetted, unscreened leaking that gets on the internet without any intermediation by something like the New York Times or its editorial board, it's out there for the world to see. And so you have this very strange dichotomy.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk in the sort of height of the WikiLeaks period that this was this sort of new model, right? It was people not going to news organizations, but going to Julian Assange or whomever, and they would just post things indiscriminately on the web. And there were these predictions of, all these clones of WikiLeaks that would spread, that would pop up and do it. Now, we haven't seen that. And, it's partly because, an organization is only as good as, the people who will give it information, right? And so it may have just been that WikiLeaks had its moment because there was one gigantic amount of information that one person had stolen and given it to them. And so once that dried up, it wasn't like, and especially because they're now prosecuting Bradley Manning, that's again a deterrent to future Bradley Mannings from doing the same thing. So, is that the future? And then there is this, there's the additional argument about, is WikiLeaks journalism? Are the people who, is Julian Assange a journalist in the sense that he, like me, takes classified information and reports it or posts it? I would make a case that they're very different. WikiLeaks is very different from the New York Times. We get information, we sift through it, we try to analyze it ourselves, we try to present it to readers based on, now some would say, well, you're using your own filter, you have your own biases. If I get the pure information, I can make my own decisions. But I think our job as reporters and news organizations is to make it understandable for people because they don't have time to read 100,000 classified State Department cables. So our job is to sift through them and decide what we think is important and what readers should know.
Well, this is like the difference within the intelligence community between collection and analysis. And you guys are performing the analysis function. You could say WikiLeaks in effect is like a case officer collecting dumps of information and just throwing it out there. You guys are providing the analysis.
Yeah, I think that as a reporter, it's funny. So I spent 5 years covering the Pentagon and about 6 years now covering the intelligence world. And I feel like it's much harder to talk to people in the intelligence world, unlike active duty people in the military who are generals who will talk to you. But really the work that you do with the CIA, I mean, it's very close to what you do as a reporter. Whereas the CIA sort of separates the functions, though. They've got the collectors, and then the analysts take the raw collected information and write reports. I mean, it's kind of what we do as reporters, collect and analyze and write them up. So you do sort of find that when you sit down with some former CIA people, often you find you're kind of on the same wavelength because you're interested in the same things. You do a lot of the same job. You're interested in secrets. You're interested in finding things that a government might not want you to know. In the case of this CIA person, it's some other foreign government, and in many cases, for me, it's our government.
So I want to open it to the floor for questions, but I want to give you one last question to take us back to the original topic of the war in the shadows. It seems to me one of the most fascinating parts about it from the U.S. government institutional perspective is we have more than one team we can deploy for this particular fight. Is that good that we have both special ops and CIA paramilitary capacities? Is it problematic? And if it's problematic, why is that? I mean, the 9/11 Commission report, after all, had recommended that the CIA operation just be turned over to JSOC, in effect, to operate. And that obviously has not happened.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like the one of the 30-something recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, there was only a couple that were not implemented, and that was one of them. And they said, they said, the CIA paramilitary function should be stripped from the agency and given to the military. Interestingly, that just died a quiet death in part because CIA didn't want it to happen, and interestingly, the Pentagon didn't want it to happen. Rumsfeld, for as much as he was into sort of building an empire, and I think it's still unclear, but I think it's they in the Pentagon felt concerned that they were going to be the sole source for all sort of secret paramilitary operations, and that maybe there were some legal problems that they wouldn't need to worry about. That maybe the CIA does have some use because they operate under different authorities, under covert actions, and maybe we the Pentagon will go through these wrenching episodes like the CIA has, where they have to wring their hands about all the bad stuff that they did, and there's all sorts of very public accounting for it. I don't know, but I think that there's good things and bad things about this convergence. I think that if you say the Bin Laden operation certainly was a great success that could have been, it was a risky operation that could have gone horribly wrong. It is an example of the CIA doing analytical work, the imagery analysts looking at a compound, ultimately the Navy SEALs executing the mission inside of a country we're not at war with, and where they were prepared fully if the whole thing had gone badly to fight the Pakistan military. Now that would have been ugly. But so that was a case of this convergence that actually worked well. But I think that, one thing you should think about for the future is, we've become very good at something, and when you become very good at something, you tend to use it a lot, and it becomes the answer to all of your problems. So maybe there's a seductive quality to this secret war stuff that maybe somewhere down the road we're going to be wishing we had spent more time thinking about.
So we're like the proverbial man with the hammer who sees every problem as a nail.
Right.
Perhaps got to watch out for that. All right. Well, you guys have all been patient. I'd love to get some questions from the audience now, starting with Jeremy.
So this was fascinating. Thank you so much. And I think your final point is a really profound one. I just wanted to get more details on what the reporting procedure and authority of the executive. How does JSOC and how does the CIA with regard to how do they work with the president on a daily basis? To what extent is he briefed?
Yeah.
Briefs him? And to what extent does he control operations? Or do they actually kill and then tell him?
Well, here's my understanding. I think the CIA, because they have a pretty blanket authority, they have this sort of, the finding that was written after 9/11 kind of gives them authority to capture, kill Al-Qaeda wherever. And they use that, and so these drone strikes that they carry out in Pakistan, they are not briefed every day to the White House. The president does not sign off on each one. They have authority to do what they call signature strikes, which is we don't even know who we're going after, but these guys look suspicious, and we're going to take this strike and analyze it and then tell the White House. So my understanding is that that's the CIA's reporting authority after the fact.
Even if there's an American on the ground?
Now, no, if there's an American, I think, so for instance, the Alaki case, I think that, we know that there was a separate legal opinion written about Alaki, so there was this was all discussed extensively, including at the presidential level, giving them the authority to put him on a list to kill. JSOC has different authorities. It's under, in legal code, it's Title 10, and it's my understanding that there actually is more of a kind of a committee that decides on taking strikes, and that includes people at the White House. So they have to sort of each time sign off on whether it's in Yemen or Somalia. They have to decide, okay, is this what is the potential collateral damage? Is it worth it? Is this person high enough to do it? But so I do think that it's watched a lot more closely. There's a committee that includes I think John Brennan at the White House that oversees the sort of secret military operations.
To follow up on that a little bit, so the Signature Strike Authority makes a lot of sense in a context like the Fatah, where part of what you're doing is you're going after specific high-value identified al-Qaeda targets, but part of it is, and other leadership figures from other groups, but part of it is also you're effectively providing force beyond the Afghan battlefield in the back office staging areas for insurgent groups that may be coming in and could group and cluster in ways that actually do make sense as a signature strike model. Is it the case that that's not the that's an AFPAC thing? And you don't see the signature strike model in Gulf of Aden region?
I think that's correct. I think that the CIA has not done many strikes in Yemen, as far as I know. Most of the stuff in Yemen has been military, but that they don't have the authority to do signature strikes in Yemen or elsewhere. In other words, they have to know, have very good intelligence about who it is they're going after. I think on the Pakistan side, as you said, a lot of it is because of the proximity of the Afghan battlefield, and they're worried about people crossing the border. There is a concern inside the CIA, and among others in the intelligence world, about the sort of mission creep of the drones, where you've expanded the portfolio of people. I mean, what has started as a specific weapon used to go after al-Qaeda and high-value guys has become just this sort of routine tool used to help the military.
Air Force.
Yeah, you're the Air Force. You're the secret Air Force. And what does that mean? I mean, when it becomes so routine, and again, it's one of those things like maybe you say, well, who cares? Again, it's this sort of this becomes so routine. We do it so often. We may not know what the implications are.
Okay. Other questions, David?
You mentioned the sort of institutional pendulum for what the CIA feels comfortable doing. Is there a sort of kind of ideal point on the swing for what you think the CIA ought to be able to do and not do? And as a sort of follow-up, now that, or barring the rejection of folding over the CIA and JSOC, is there any movement towards treating like actions alike? Or do you see there being kind of two legal tracks for the different institutions, even though the actions are the same?
I think I do hear more and more about people saying, it's absurd that we have these parallel organizations, Title 10 and Title 50. Actually, Dennis Blair, the former director of national intelligence, actually says we need Title 60. Like we put them together, and it makes a whole lot more sense. So I do think so, but whether there's a real appetite to sort of overhaul the system, I don't know whether, I don't think it's happening anytime soon. And I think that, again, there will be, to some degree, it's also institutional bureaucracies keeping their own role in this that's going to continue. The CIA will continue to be the favored agency of the White House as long as they are doing this counterterrorism stuff. So therefore, why would they give it up? And similarly, the Pentagon, I mean, you see it in the Pentagon strategy of, cutting, amidst these budget cuts, they're increasing the amount of money for drones, special operations, and so they're all sort of seeing the future, and in the great Washington budget game, it's you all want a piece of what the future is, and so you all position yourselves to get a piece of it. The question about what's the ideal, it's hard to say. I mean, I think that, and again, I think we're still trying to sift through how much of the opportunity costs, how much has there been opportunity costs for the CIA not doing things over the last decade because they've so been involved in counterterrorism. I mean, I think that there's a decent argument to be saying that this air campaign, this air war in Pakistan, should not be done by the CIA. That it's so out in the open anyway. It's not a secret to anyone. This is a Pentagon mission, and the CIA should be doing something else. I think that the CIA will always maintain its covert action abilities. They're never going to because again, they always look at, they always think they're blamed for everything. So they think they're blamed for being too aggressive and getting the U.S. in trouble for being too aggressive. And then they're convinced they're always blamed for being risk averse and blowing things like 9/11. And so there's always, I do think that there is some truth to what you hear, the complaints in the CIA that they're always the ones holding the bag. So it's I don't know if there's a happy medium. I do think that and just from talking to people who have been in this and who are experts, they see the downside for this excessive. For instance, in Pakistan, I mean, you've destroyed your relationships with the ISI in Pakistan, and to the point where they've never fully trusted each other. They really don't trust each other now. There's really kind of a non-relationship, and if you're the CIA, you kind of want to have a relationship with the liaison service, right? And if your covert operations in that country have destroyed the relationship, maybe you have someone else do it, and you build up those relationships, which are important.
If you had to guess, I can't resist intervening with the question. If you had to guess about the future course of where we are with the Pakistanis in a 2014 onward world in which we're down to say 5,000 training support in some special forces guys in Afghanistan, where are we going to be with the Pakistanis? Do you can you forecast the relationship at all?
I guess the best forecast would be that we're on a downward trajectory where we're trying to both sort of disassociate from ourselves, get out of this embrace we've been in for 10 years, because it's just end up angering both sides. We've seen this throughout history. We saw it in the 80s where the US and Pakistan were very close because of the war in Afghanistan. We pulled apart in the 90s. In fact, because of their nuclear tests, we sanctioned them. They felt like we abandoned Afghanistan, we abandoned them. So there was this period where we both went to both corners. 9/11 happens, we're back and in each other's business, and we're sick of each other again, so we're pulling apart. And I think that as long as we ramp down in Afghanistan, then it's inevitable that the US and Pakistan will certainly be pulling away from each other. And I think that the Pakistanis are happy about that. Now, it means less money, but at the same time, it means that the US is less in the business of South Asia, Central Asia. The Pakistanis can probably once go back to having much more control over things in Afghanistan. I think that's the end game where they're trying to negotiate a settlement where the Taliban has, and certainly, or at least the Pashtuns have a very big role in a future government, and that means if they have a role, then Pakistan has a role. And I think that they want to ensure that is their future, because when they look at their own neighborhood, they see, they basically want not to worry about Afghanistan, have their proxies there, so they can once again go back to worrying about India. And the problem as they see it from the last 10 years is this annoying war in Afghanistan has taken them away from fighting India. But I mean, I don't want to be glib. There's also been a lot of terrorism inside Pakistan, and they've seen the costs in their mind of associating too closely to the United States, with the United States. It's blown back, and as much as they say there's some who say, well, this only shows, this is what the US wants to believe, it shows that we're all committed to the same fight, we're all against terrorism, because Pakistanis are experiencing too. But there's also a strain in Pakistan that says, you know, if we just not hitched our wagon to you guys, we wouldn't have had this. So if we stop with this close relationship, the terrorism will go away.
Fascinating. Yes, in the back there, sir.
Yeah, I think many, if not all of us, are well aware of the kind of the unfortunate situation with Black Hawk Down, but we also know there's a dysfunctional government in Somalia, and it's kind of the breeding ground of pirates and kidnappings, and a lot of bad stuff is going on. Maybe not as much so as Yemen. But why, can you talk a bit about why the U.S. has not gotten more aggressively involved with drones or whatever in terms of Somalia?
Somalia is an interesting, a really interesting case where you bring up Black Hawk Down. I mean, it's still the sort of indelible image for people, and that's been the sort of going in position since 9/11 is how are we going to deal with Somalia without sending any American troops, because we don't want to do that again. So I think from the beginning, the Pentagon has said, well, we're not going there, with the exception of JSOC, small amounts of JSOC operations, but even they have been pretty limited. There's an increase in drone operations in Somalia, but drones are very much dependent on intelligence. You have to know where to fly them, and they don't have great intelligence about Somalia. So what you find is like the Somalia is kind of like the ultimate. I mean, this is like a case study of this problem in miniature, where you have a place you don't want to go in large number. You think a lot of bad guys. You don't have very good intelligence. So there's been a lot of outsourcing, hiring of contractors, gathering intelligence with contractors. It's a complete free-for-all. And so I think that you're starting to see more drone activity. They've also relied on African peacekeeping troops to try to fight the Shabaab. That's been another proxy. We used the Ethiopian troops as a proxy force in 2007, 2008. It's kind of like the premise has been anyone but us. And so I don't think that you're going to see, you're not going to see the US in large numbers in Somalia. I mean, I suppose that could change if there's another 9/11 type event that clearly originated from Somalia. But there's been this feeling like that we're not going to deal with the problem. We got to contain the problem in Somalia as opposed to go in and root out the problem. And I think it's still pretty much a containment issue.
Yes.
As a reporter, you sort of alluded to this. Is there a cozy relationship between the media and administration officials like a CIA director? Because we're talking today, very matter-of-factly, about all these targeted assassinations. Mm-hmm. About 10 militants were killed.
Yeah.
How do we know they were militants? Who were they? And there seems to be less interest in it, whereas a targeted apprehension 10 years ago was given an exhaustive amount of coverage, and rightly so, but we're hearing a lot more of Gitmo then, but we're not hearing about it today. Is there pressure on you as a reporter?
There's no pressure. I think that, you've raised a fundamental question, right? How do we know anything? I mean, how do we know, and this is the sort of problem of war in secret, right? If you don't come out publicly and said, okay, this target was hit, this is what we believe, who was at a compound, this is the, you have people talking about publicly, you basically have people talking about privately saying, oh, no, these were militants. I mean, it is very hard to know. It's also why, drones are the ultimate weapon of secret war because they operate in places where journalists can't go, independent human rights organizations can't necessarily travel. It's very hard for independent verification for this stuff. On your question of whether there's a cozy relationship, I mean, I guess it depends on how people would define it as cozy. If the administration is saying something about, X number of people killed, we will usually report it and say, administration officials say there were bad people there. It's impossible to verify. If there's a specific named individual, we will say, and we have it from multiple sources, we will say so-and-so was killed according to administration officials. A lot of times they do get independently verified in Pakistan or wherever. It's very hard. this isn't sort of letting us off the hook, but it's very hard to do this sort of independent reporting on some of this stuff, as opposed to having dozens or hundreds of journalists in Afghanistan running around after an airstrike and say, okay, I was at this village. I mean, it's happened several times. In Afghanistan, an airstrike goes badly, and you have a reporter there the next day saying, the Pentagon said 10 people were killed. In fact, 100 people were killed, right? It's a lot harder to do in Yemen, Pakistan, these places. So that's one of the problems we encounter. On your question about capturing and killing, the apprehension, I think you could take this too far, but I do think that to a degree there's a view that within the CIA, capturing people got us into a lot of hot water. With the whole torture allegations and everything. It's easier to kill people. And it takes care of our detainee problem. It takes care of our interrogation problem.
The CIA is meant to gather intelligence. You don't get intelligence from a dead man.
Exactly.
You get intelligence from someone sitting in Gitmo for 5 years.
No, and so that is the trade-off, right? Is what intelligence have you sacrificed by killing people? And I mean, this is the sort of heart of the issue right now, and I think that's what it's been. One of the most interesting trajectories of the last 10 years is, the CIA after 9/11 were doing predators, but not in a big way. They were going and they were capturing people, and then there was the whole argument and the very big controversy over how they were interrogating people and capturing and detaining them in secret, and then there were. That was such a searing experience for them. I mean, no one has really said this publicly to me, or as that matter of fact, they said, "Oh yeah, we just made a decision. We're just going to start killing them." But I do think that there's an element of that. It's cleaner.
When Brennan talked about this up at the Harvard Brookings event last fall, he vehemently denied that when there's a possibility of a capture for the intelligence gathering reason, he said, "We will always go for the capture." But as you say, the drones are going to places where we can't go in on foot, and to a certain extent. The claim is that the pattern of drone strikes in Fatah and Yemen and occasionally maybe Somalia, these are places where capture really wasn't an option. And I imagine that's clearly true in many instances. The question is it true in all instances?
Right.
Like Salih Naban, when JSOC, ostensibly, we think probably JSOC attacked in a helicopter raid on his convoy in Somalia. Could that have been a capture operation instead? Mm-hmm. Maybe.
Right.
Well,
and there's also what is the perceived, with all these guys in Pakistan, the political sensitivity of cross-border operations constantly into Pakistan. There's that. The diplomacy is that the feeling is that that Pakistan will allow drone strikes, but they will not allow daily JSOC raids across the border from Afghanistan. Yeah.
It's understandable. All right, well, we're out of time. Let's thank our guest, Mark. That was wonderful.
Thank you.